All right. Good morning, everybody from Baltimore. I'm Ian Saldana, and I'm an associate professor here of epidemiology at Hopkins. So welcome to our May monthly seminar for the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis, the last of our academic year. So we are ending on a high here. I'm very happy to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Julian Elliott. Dr. Elliott has an MBBS and an FRACP and is a professor of evidence synthesis at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Where it is 10:30 at night, but Julian is not in Melbourne at the moment. He's in Geneva, so it's a much more, as he said, humane time of the day to do this. So we're happy for that. So Dr. Elliott has worked in the past as a lot of experience doing infectious disease clinical practice and also worked on HIV clinical trials. He's currently has been the co-founder and CEO of the Future Evidence Foundation, and he's going to talk about that and the Living Evidence Foundation, the work that he's doing. Through the Future Evidence Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that produces Covidence. So those of us who've used Covidence for screening and data extraction, et cetera, for systematic reviews, know that it is an excellent software for evidence synthesis. He's going to talk to us today about living evidence and talk about the living evidence model and his work that's ongoing globally about this. So over to you, Julian. Thank you for doing this and welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you to Ian for inviting me to come and speak today. Thank you all for your time. And thanks also to Amy for all the logistics and helping us get ready. So it's very nice to be with you today. So I'll just share some slides. Just let me know if you can see these.
Yes, we can see that.
That's great. Yeah, so I'll be predominantly talking about this model we call living evidence. And I'm very, very interested to get into the discussion. So I will cover the kind of core of this, and then I'm sure we'll have lots of things to discuss. So first of all, just in terms of my interests or potential competing interests, Ian's mentioned some of these already, but just to be crystal clear, so I have appointments at Monash, had various roles in Cochrane. I'll be talking a little bit about the Australian Living Evidence Collaboration. So, and then out of that, the COVID task force, and then also co-founder and CEO of Future Evidence Foundation, as Ian mentioned. So maybe one of the other disclosures is a lot of my work in this kind of area really was driven by some time I spent in Cambodia. So I trained in infectious diseases. I was doing clinical trials, but then spent a number of years in Cambodia, both in a research and programmatic roles in HIV and HIV-TB. And really there, particularly my programmatic role, ended up playing like what we would now think of as a knowledge broker role. So I was providing technical assistance to the ministry and ended up being the kind of key conduit between research findings and the programmatic and policy decisions that were being made within the ministry. And of course, like many of us, very frustrated about the limitations of our evidence systems and our ability to understand quickly and easily what the current research was saying. So even though I've spent a lot of my career running clinical trials, running clinical trial unit, it was this kind of experience that really drove me back into the kind of more evidence synthesis and evidence translation world. So when we think about evidence and the way we use evidence in practice, you know, this was the model. The model was, you know, health practitioners would read journal articles, and that was the way that they kept up to date with what was happening in a particular research field. And for a period of time, that was an adequate way of appraising all of the research that was relevant to particular clinical practice, because the amount of research being produced was so sparse. But I think often people don't, I think, appreciate just how dramatically the volume and complexity of research has grown over time. So it is true exponential growth. Of course, it varies by field, but overall it is exponential growth with a doubling time of about 14 years overall, if you look across all of science. That is an enormous amount of growth. And so it becomes, of course, increasingly difficult for any human to keep up to date and really make sense in a very rigorous way regarding all the research advances, and not only in their own field, but also other adjacent fields that might be relevant to their practice or to their research. And so because of this and frustrations with the very ad hoc nature of the way that research was being used in clinical practice, we had the advent of systematic reviews, what I often think of as the science of making sense of science. So if we spend so much time and effort and money essentially creating data, science is about empiricism, it's about running experiments and through that accruing data that can inform our view of the world. So if we invest so much in the accrual of those primary data sets, we need to take care of those data as they transition into real world practice and into the systems that really shape society and shape outcomes for not only in healthcare, but in other fields as well. And so systematic review was developed over the last 30 years or so, really as that scientific method of understanding science with a very strong focus on minimizing the risk of bias that could shape the way that people understand research. And so really an enormous amount of methodological research that has gone on to continually improve those methods to ensure that bias is minimized. So I think sometimes people can think of systematic review as a kind of a, somewhat more souped up literature review. I often say it's really not a literature review, it is a scientific project. And for those of you who have been involved, I think you understand the size and scope and complexity is closer to a primary research project than it is to a literature review. So that has been a really major step forward in science, and then has had many other kind of associated developments, one of which being evidence-based guidelines, where there's been a lot of work to develop more rigorous and transparent and systematic ways of developing guidelines. So not just what do we know, but what should we do? And together, this has really underpinned the development of evidence systems that we use in healthcare systems. So this is an image from what was the IOM, looking at the way that systematic reviews and clinical practice guidelines can improve decision-making in healthcare. So, I think it's always important to understand that these methods don't exist in isolation. They are embedded in systems, organizations, relationships, power dynamics, and resource flows that are deeply connected into our healthcare system. And so now are, really part of the kind of standard way that healthcare is practiced and the way that we seek to improve healthcare practice, all the way from, drug regulatory decisions right through to kind of major program design and funding decisions. But of course, as many of you know very well, there's a number of challenges in this world, and one of them is really about the time, effort, and cost of doing systematic reviews or other kind of forms of evidence synthesis. So these are data from some years ago. This is a Cochrane data set looking at the time from publishing a systematic review protocol to the publication of the review itself, being a bit over 2 years. Now, other reviews can be done in a shorter time, but it's still many, many months, often more than a year. And if we seek to achieve more rapid systematic reviews, then it's often quite a lot of investment in order to achieve that. So they are slow and expensive and often very, very difficult to keep up to date with new research, particularly as the flow of new research keeps accelerating. And as I mentioned earlier, that's an exponential acceleration that we are experiencing. And so that creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, we get what I sometimes call science by Twitter, or I guess I should call now science by X. So this idea essentially that all of us as decision makers are therefore forced to use kind of quick and dirty methods. So this could be, a quick PubMed search, a literature review, or what we would call a narrative review, talking to some experts, convening an expert panel. All of these methods, of course, have a role. They're widely used. They're often the only choice that decision makers have. But again, we've got decades of research showing that they are much, much more prone to bias, to opinion, to the influence of competing interests, of vested interests, sometimes of commercial interests, that really distort decision making in very problematic and harmful ways. And so when you think about this, I mean, I think this is an absolute tragedy that still today, for most decisions, and this goes well beyond health, we in general have this trade-off. We have this trade-off between the quality of the evidence summary or the research evidence that we can use in our decisions and its currency, the degree to which it's up to date with the latest research. And so living evidence, very, very simply, just tries to break that trade-off and to say, actually, through different ways of working, and yes, with some assistance from technology, etc., we should be able to break this trade-off and create forms of evidence that are usable by decision makers, that gives them, I think, what in the end most people want, and I think actually expect that evidence systems would produce, which is a clear understanding of the research at that particular moment. And that clear understanding, I think, depends on what I would say is fidelity to the underlying research through the methodological quality of the work. And also it's a clear picture of research because it's currently up to date. It's not missing the last, X number of months or so of research. So how do we do living evidence? So this is a graphic, I think it just gives you some understanding the kind of core design of the model. So if you think of a conventional model of doing evidence, as it were, so any sort of evidence product, so whether it's a systematic review, another type of review, say a health guideline, even a policy brief, other kind of derivative products, typically we will go through a process of defining the topic or the questions, developing that evidence summary or guideline, going through approvals and then publication. And typically the work will stop at that point. But because new research keeps flowing, it therefore over time becomes an incomplete summary of the research evidence in that particular field. And so therefore you can say its reliability or its accuracy actually declines over time. Therefore the usefulness, the utility of this evidence summary or other product declines over time. And therefore our return on our initial investment in that product also declines over time. So we get this kind of erosion of value because it no longer is the kind of comprehensive or somewhat definitive view of the research at that point. And then at some point, conditions become sufficient to launch an update. So it could be stakeholder demands, just complete frustration with how useless this piece of evidence is, whatever circumstances, and we then go and we do an update. And for those of you who have been involved in updates, often the phrase is, it was basically as much work as the original piece of evidence work that we had to do. And so it's like climbing the mountain again and then going down to the valley. So it's this producing evidence and these kind of intermittent updates can just continually feels like climbing mountains, collapsing, exhausted, climbing another mountain. So in a living evidence model, in contrast, it's about walking along plateaus. So there is no escaping the fact that you have to climb that initial mountain. If you don't have your evidence summary or guideline in an up-to-date state, you need to get it into that up-to-date state first, what we would often call a baseline version. So go through all the kind of typical steps. And during this period, there is absolutely no difference to a kind of conventional evidence project. But what differs is that just at the point of publication, or actually just before publication, you move into what we would call living mode, which is then where you go through these very tight cycles of your workflow and tight cycles of updating of that evidence resource, whatever it is. In practice, what that means is we maintain the protocol that is governing the work, and we can perhaps talk about this in Q&A, but that protocol may evolve over time. It's not a set and forget process. So circumstances change, questions change, outcomes change. So the protocol can evolve over time. And then we maintain the search strategies that are appropriate for that protocol. And so that might be maintaining some auto alerts through various databases, or it could be manual searching at a particular interval. And then as we identify new studies, we essentially go through the conventional workflow of, say, screening, full text review, data extraction, quality appraisal, etc., and then incorporate that new information into the summary. So whether it's a meta-analysis, qualitative synthesis, whatever, and then update the summary. So that summary might be in a web-only version on a website, or it could be a published academic output that we're then creating kind of updates from. And then, of course, associated dissemination kind of engagement activities. So we call this walking along the plateau because it is like walking along the plateau. I think many people, when they first hear about living evidence, they feel like, oh my God, are you actually serious? How could we possibly update something so frequently? Like, we nearly kill ourselves updating every 3 years or 5 years or whatever. How could we possibly update every, say, 2 months? And of course, the secret is that it's just breaking the same amount of work into smaller pieces. And so it's not no effort. Of course, there is ongoing effort, but that effort is more evenly distributed over time. And I think most teams, once they start doing this, they feel that actually this is quite, it's kind of a pleasant experience of having much more predictable, even amount of work over time. And frankly, kind of less stressful because the volume of work is kind of broken up into small pieces. So that's the basics of the model, and happy to go into a lot more of the detail kind of the operations. But just to emphasize, this is not about changing the core methods. So it's different to rapid reviews. In living evidence, living systematic reviews, we maintain all of those traditional systematic review methods. We do not change those. The only change is really process. It's a workflow or process change. And so just to give you a little bit of history and kind of a bit about the journey. So we first started doing these living reviews now about 7 years ago. So initially with Cochrane, so living Cochrane reviews, and then actually some non-Cochrane reviews funded by Rob Wood Johnson Foundation, together with colleagues who some of you know, Roger Chow and Mark Helfand. And then about 5 years ago or so, we had specialist societies approach us saying, look, we've been doing these guideline updates, evidence-based grade guideline updates every 4 or 5 years or so. And we can't keep going. Just the volume of research that we need to process for each update is now just it's just infeasible for us to now do a kind of conventional update. We've heard about this living evidence thing. Do you think we could apply it to guidelines? And so we formed this consortium with a number of groups in Australia to essentially pilot the application of this now into guidelines. So the first was the Australian National Stroke Clinical Guidelines. And then we also did work in diabetes and also in rheumatology. and really showed that you can also then apply this model into guidelines. And then along came COVID. And so like all of us, where our life became completely dominated by COVID, one of the things that became obvious very early, and actually I was in DC in March 2020, and it was very clear, I think both in the US and then also when I went back to Australia, was you had this immediate flurry of statements coming out from everyone. There were policy positions, they were guidelines, clinical protocols, flow charts, anything to do with and all these different questions around COVID, but they were generally low quality. They were all contradictory. It was a complete and utter mess. And so we had discussions with our federal government in Australia saying, look, we know that we're heading into an incredibly difficult time. The least we can do for our clinician colleagues is create some clarity. So as the flood of COVID research comes out, which we knew was coming, can we somehow try to herd all of these cats together? So we are kind of trying to speak with one voice and just trying to create more signal or more clarity for clinicians so they weren't going to be bombarded by all these conflicting messages. And so we set up this group called the National COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force. And then somewhat crazily, we made this kind of statement at the start saying, we will do evidence-based grade guidelines and we will update them every week. We had no idea how we were going to do it. And so we started with, I think, 4 national peak organizations as partners, but eventually it grew to 38 partners. And again, the whole idea was building a consortium around the living evidence model in order to create this kind of more coherent approach for clinicians. So I've just got some slides here because people often ask, well, how did you do that? So let me just quickly run through these slides, which gives you some idea, just the kind of the mechanics, because I think sometimes this can help make it a bit more tangible. So as always, we start with a question. And so it could be any clinical question. And we had a website where we were actively promoting to clinicians around the country saying, just submit your questions, any question you want. And we would then go through a process. And so it could be from clinicians, mostly from clinicians, to be honest, sometimes from consumers or policymakers. And then that would be taken through to our kind of peak clinical group called the Guideline Leadership Group to make sure it was in scope. And we would do some initial prioritization. We would then convert that into a structured question that we could then do searching on, what's called a PICO question. We were searching various databases every night. And so every morning we would have new hits from those searches, and they would be fed through to our evidence team. The evidence team, we're often asked, like, how much resource did it take to run this? So it would generally vary between kind of 4 to 6 people, full-time equivalent. So it was a reasonable sized team, but it was certainly not massive. And then we would go through, again, all the standard process. So, essentially creating and maintaining living systematic reviews for the different topics, doing all the grade assessments, and then presenting those evidence summaries each week to one of the many clinical panels that we'd established. We also had this kind of pool of additional experts with very specific expertise that we could draw into panels if needed. We also had a consumer panel bringing the kind of patient perspectives, and an independent conflicts of interest committee actually led by Lisa Barrow in Colorado. And those panels would do the usual, appraisal of the evidence, drafting of recommendations, and then those recommendations would go back to that peak clinical expert group, the Guideline Leadership Group, and that actually functioned very well as a kind of peer review mechanism. So each panel would draft, but would then have to seek approval of the leadership group. If they didn't agree, it would go back to the individual panel. And remember, this is happening every week. And so it was literally panels mostly meeting Monday, Tuesday, guideline leadership group on Wednesday. It would then go to our government colleagues. So we'd identified key contacts in all our state and federal departments of health. They would have an opportunity to input on, we would say, important implementation considerations. So not to change the recommendation itself. And it would then go through to our steering committee, which were the chief executive officers of each of those organizations. And then every Friday, we would publish recommendations. We would only do this if we had 100% consensus of all the membership, all the member organizations. So everyone had the right of veto. If something was vetoed, it would then go back into the process. So it wasn't a dead forever. It was just an opportunity then to revise. And then from then on, we would go through all the dissemination mechanisms. So we would have, social media, traditional media, etc., spreading the word, and all of our member organizations also through their newsletters and all their other channels. And over time, it really did become the kind of source of truth where clinicians would go for guidance on COVID matters. So that just as an example, we don't recommend it. It was kind of crazy. It was very kind of COVID specific. But they're the kind of processes that you can run if you're wanting to run some sort of living evidence or living guideline process. Just overall then, over these first few years of this work, what we've demonstrated, when you work it out, it's actually a 99% reduction in the time from a study being published to going through a systematic review into a evidence-based guideline and then being available at a point of care. And that's really because, in many of these fields, so this is an example in stroke, of course, those guidelines are only being updated every several years, every, say, 4 or 5 years. Pre-COVID, we got that down to every few months. And then with COVID, we got that down to about 3 weeks. So we really kind of pushed the envelope, showed the feasibility and the kind of practical application of the living evidence model. And then post-COVID, or sorry, I should say during the pandemic, we also worked very closely with NICE, the major guideline organization in the UK, and also with the WHO. Other groups were also using the living evidence model. So for example, IDSA in the US. And now post-COVID, I think there's many groups now kind of adopting this model. And here's just some examples. So certainly in health, but now also beyond health. So in climate and education and other areas. I'd also just emphasize this one. So Wellcome Trust has funded us and others in a consortium called Galanos, where we're running living evidence projects. So doing living systematic reviews in mental health. But the specific purpose of this project is not to inform practice or policy, it's actually to inform research strategy. So, we've been talking to funders for years about this. It's like, if you're going to make strategic investments in research, then, that research prioritization exercise, should always, of course, draw together what are the important questions of the relevant stakeholders together with an accurate, essentially, evidence gap map. So what do we know and what we don't know? If you're doing that evidence gap map, surely you want a very rigorous and detailed understanding of what the research has shown and what it hasn't. And by definition, it should be absolutely up to date with the latest research. So therefore, that is, by definition, a living evidence undertaking. And so, although we've been banging on about this for years and years, it's really only Wellcome now as the first major research funder to understand the kind of opportunity of using living evidence for research prioritization. So I now thought I would just run through some of the kind of common questions, like kind of FAQs, just as a brief summary, and then of course, happy to get into more detail during discussion. So we're often asked, what's the definition of living evidence, or what's the definition of a living systematic review or living guideline? We have generally resisted having a very precise definition because, one, we say it's still early days. We're still learning what this is and how it's best used. But also importantly, that our view is that the frequency of updating, which is often people's question, we believe should be driven by the needs of end users. And it depends on the context. So for example, in COVID, of course, the stakes were so high and the research was flowing so fast that it made sense to be updating every week. In many other fields, you could be updating every 2 to 3 months, and that would achieve currency for end users. So it's whatever end users need in order to feel confident that this is current, that it is a definitive resource, that I don't need to worry about or look beyond this for more recent research. And so typically, I would say many projects is a kind of around 1 to 3 monthly cycles of updating, and in general, no longer than 6 monthly. Sometimes people are doing annual updates and calling it living evidence. We're a little bit like, ugh, not sure that's really living evidence. And then we're often asked which topics should be living. So first of all, we say not everything should be living, and living evidence is not a life sentence. So if you put something into living mode, it doesn't have to stay in living mode forever. You know, questions are kind of born. They become important questions to whichever community it is. You often then get accrual of a lot of small studies. Then you may start to get into some larger studies being published. And then at a certain time, you either have high certainty evidence where the addition of new information is not really going to make any difference to your understanding of the evidence that we have to inform that question. And so it may no longer be appropriate to maintain in a living mode, or it may be that the question is just no longer relevant or no longer importance to end users. So in terms of the types of questions that we suggest are perhaps most appropriate for living evidence approach, particularly early on. So if an organization is just starting to do this, I think the most important thing is really questions that are of importance to stakeholders. So it does take more effort to get going in living evidence. We're often, again, asked just about the kind of feasibility and the funding of living evidence. It feels like it's a very big endeavor. But again, because that kind of walking along the plateau kind of workflows, you know, teams often find that once they've got various questions in living mode, they can actually keep adding and adding and adding, and it becomes quite feasible to maintain a large number of questions in living mode. Of course, depending on the amount of new research becoming available in each question. So in terms of costing, like very, very roughly, we would say, and of course this varies, but the cost of maintaining an evidence summary or other kind of resource in a living mode is roughly equivalent to updating, say, every 3 to 4 years. Very, very roughly. But if an organization is just starting on the journey, just starting to do living evidence, then it takes a bit more resource, more for kind of like process change and organizational change and governance. And, you know, you can often think of it as like an innovation project. So if you're going to spend that additional resource, then better to focus that on questions that are important to your end users. But of course, also, that's a way of building kind of collaborations around living evidence. And I think more and more we're realizing that the true opportunity with living evidence is not just like a better evidence product. It's really about the opportunity to build very effective partnerships around the living evidence, because it's an ongoing conversation. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So, question of importance to stakeholders, where there's still ongoing uncertainty in the evidence and where new research is emerging. So at least some movement in the research field. Again, starting off, it often makes sense to focus on areas where there's a fair flow of new research coming. It's a reasonably active field. So particularly topics where there's like some controversy or there's a bit of kind of buzz, a bit of movement are often are good areas to start with. What's needed for success? So we always say this is not rocket science. It is no new methods. It's just difference in processes. So any team that is experienced in doing good quality systematic reviews can do living reviews. If you can do a grade guideline, you can do a living grade guideline. But what often helps, of course, is organizational buy-in, a champion, a driver, and then strong project management. And I would really emphasize that. A lot of this is really about just good project management.
Julian, can I interrupt you? Is it okay if we take a question now, or do you want to wait for the end? I see a hand up. I should have asked you this earlier.
That's fine. I'm just thinking, why don't we, it might be good just to finish and then we
Okay.
let the questions flow. If that's okay, Douglas, sorry to keep going. We're often asked about, does it lead to burnout? Like the team, it feels like, again, like a life sentence. It's not, but it can feel like, oh my God, there's an enormous amount of work that you have to keep doing and doing and doing. Again, I'll just emphasize that it's kind of more smaller pieces of work. So the teams often find it quite feasible. And we really have not found that it leads to burnout. It is, of course, important to have ongoing turnover in the team. No one wants to be doing exactly the same thing all the time. But it's also, I think, a great way of maintaining institutional memory. In a conventional approach, when you go to do an update, you may not be able to draw on the people who did the original work. And so you've lost a lot of that institutional memory. Whereas in this model, you've got a gradual turnover of the team, and so that institutional memory is more easily maintained. It's also a great opportunity for career development, because more junior researchers can join the team, learn about the process, and over time, of course, move into more senior positions. So we've found very, very strong engagement from the team and the panel. We've got data on this. And just kind of to make this clear, I think our panel members they just love the opportunity to be discussing with their peers, with the support of a rigorous evidence process, the latest research. So not just the latest study, but what this means in the context of the body of evidence. And so in these kind of regular discussions, they're essentially at the cutting edge, of research. And then, of course, they can bring that back into their own network. So it becomes a very important way, I think, for them, the position that they have in their own network. Just briefly, I see this as kind of analogous to clinical trial networks, the way that those networks persist over long periods of time and the way that they can maintain institutional memory and be a great pathway for career development. The other concern we've often had is, does this lead to confusion in end users? Are you constantly bombarding them with new evidence or new recommendations? And do they just get completely and utterly kind of bamboozled or confused by that? I think it's important to remember that even though you can have quite dynamic accrual of new information within the systematic review or then feeding into the guideline, the actual conclusions of those reviews or the recommendations that you're making based on those reviews actually change quite infrequently. And so as an example, the living stroke guidelines, I think there's about 150 topics or so. We've found that every 2 or 3 months when there's an update, there's probably only 1 or 2 kind of key changes. So it moves into a kind of what's new kind of dissemination opportunity. And so it actually becomes much easier for clinicians or other end users to understand what the guidelines are now saying, because it's really only 1 or 2 messages that you're giving at each point of dissemination, rather than every 5 years you're saying, well, here's the 25 things that have changed. And again, we can get into the detail of this, but because evidence methods, both in systematic review and guidelines, are always appraising our confidence in the effect estimate or in the likelihood that new information would change a recommendation, we actually do not see this kind of concern around flip-flopping of recommendations. I will go through this now very quickly, but we often will disseminate through a website. There are ways to have kind of updated journal articles and versioning of that. Very happy to talk more about that. In terms of knowledge translation, again, I think one of our key learnings is it creates a very interesting opportunity to engage stakeholders in ongoing conversations. And a lot of our work now, through a new initiative called ALIVE, the Alliance for Living Evidence, is building really meaningful national or global partnerships of decision-making organizations around living evidence in order to create those ongoing conversations and really get organizations aligned in their understanding and then their actions to push forward practice and policy change. This was just a slide I wanted to show just on the website we had in the COVID work, showing how we were, eliciting questions from the field. And so again, just to note, this became a really useful way of essentially having this ongoing conversation with clinicians out on the front line, saying your questions are directly feeding into our work, and then we bring that back to you. You then have more questions and we can continue to respond to your needs in a very dynamic way. Does living evidence change practice? So again, and just very brief summary here, we've shown that it increases web engagement, increased trust, likelihood to follow guidelines, actually the use of guidelines, and actually increases the concordance of practice with those guideline recommendations. So it does lead to improved clinical practice. Also shown that it's cost effective. These were 2 recommendations, one in stroke and one in diabetes, where we demonstrated that because of more rapid updating, it leads to more rapid dissemination of information regarding effective and cost-effective interventions, which, because healthcare is so expensive, leads to ridiculous amounts of cost savings. So from a societal perspective, this was about $1.2 billion net savings to society just from 2 recommendations. So I'm sorry to move quickly through those last slides, but I want to make sure we've got good time for discussion. Just thank all of our partners and funders, and particularly all of the individuals that have contributed to all of these living evidence and living guideline projects. Thanks very much, and very happy to dive into the discussion.
Thank you, Julian. Always inspiring to hear you talk about, in some ways, the paradigm-changing work that you've been pushing. So yeah, let's start with Doug's question. Doug had his hand up earlier, so I'd also encourage others who have questions to just raise your hands here and I'll call on you. I'll put them in the chat and I'll read them out. Go ahead,
Doug. 2 questions. First, there must be a certain size to the core team that's non-trivial. It sounds like there's a lot of people that would need to be involved in a core team here. And then the second is sort of the issue of maintenance of funding. You have a lot of partners funding it. I don't see the same national will to fund something like that in the United States. And so while I think this is a spectacularly good idea, I'm curious as to how it gets implemented and going forward.
Yeah, no, great questions. Yeah, I'm sometimes reluctant to show the COVID example because I think it's so extreme. It kind of is, maybe scares everyone. No, I mean, I think, it really just depends on the size of endeavor. We've often found that a team that has been doing traditional updates can convert to living with essentially no extra resource. Again, as I said, there's a bit of extra resource and needed just for the kind of transition. But as an example, we're working with the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK. They had a team that was doing intermittent updates of systematic reviews to support their evidence resources. They have converted now to living mode across, I think it's 180 topics with, no additional resources. So it really can be done with any size project or any size team. I think what I would talk about more is really the opportunities, as I've emphasized, the opportunity to engage with your end users in a different way, in a much kind of deeper and ongoing partnership, means that if you have the opportunity to invest in essentially stakeholder engagement activities, then you should argue strongly to get resources to do that, because I think that's potentially game-changing, more than the actual living evidence mode itself. In terms of funding, we always emphasize to funders that this is not a life sentence. It's not about recurrent funding, or that you're going to be locked into this, never-ending endeavor. All of these projects are funded as projects. So with a set kind of duration. And again, we always emphasize, like, you just fund this initial period of time, and at the end, you will make a decision about whether you're thinking you're getting an appropriate return on that investment, and it's worth a renewal of that funding or not. And if you decide not to refund, then it reverts to a conventional updating mode, essentially back to the status quo. And so for a period of time, the world has benefited from a kind of more up-to-date evidence resource. But if you stop funding, it's not, we haven't, you just revert to status quo. So we're very, very clear to emphasize to funders that, you're not locked into this forever. In terms of appetite of funders in the US, so I've been working for the last few years with the Federation of American Scientists, who are a science policy advocacy group in DC, having many, many discussions with different agencies in the US federal government. And I think there's real interest. The most advanced is AHRQ, so funders of Ian and others. And they've already funded some living systematic reviews, and I think are interested in kind of that continuing to be part of the portfolio of the Evidence Practice Center program. And then there are other groups and funders in the US, I think, are also quite interested in the model. So I wouldn't be completely pessimistic.
All right. So I'm not seeing other hands raised at the moment. So one of the things that I was thinking about, Julian, is like as I mentioned earlier, like this is the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis. So I was wondering what your thoughts were about sort of the feedback back into topics that should be prioritized for clinical trials, and the ways in which living evidence and living guidance can help close that loop.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, Wellcome are really now the first major research funder that's using this model to inform research prioritization and strategy and therefore funding. Yeah, I mean, I think many of us have been working for many years on trying to create these more dynamic kind of, evidence practice research loops. So I think that we will get to a point where we have opportunity to have more dynamic synthesis, guidance, and bringing those data back to bear on then the opportunity to define and fund new research. I think also there's just really interesting potential opportunities. This has not been done, so if someone wants to do this, but if you think of the rise of kind of platform trials, adaptive trials, registry-based trials, all of those approaches to clinical research that is about having a kind of persistent infrastructure that you then kind of embed randomization within. I mean, it's a perfect opportunity to then run a kind of living evidence stream alongside, so that as you're getting data that's being output by those endeavors, it's being incorporated, in near real time into those syntheses, and then that's feeding back either formally or informally to the decisions around which randomizations then to continue to pursue. So I've had some kind of methods debates about whether that should be kind of formally, statistically feeding into the kind of Bayesian randomizations of platform trials, or maybe it's just more kind of advisory. So I think there's that opportunity. I think also, of course, I'm sure many people here are aware, like the clear analogy in kind of development of new drugs and devices and regulatory and reimbursement kind of landscape, the move towards more conditional approval, life cycle management. It's essentially the same paradigm. It's just saying that, knowledge accrues over time, and we need to have processes and systems that are more dynamic and more able to incorporate that information over time, and then for that to feed into our decision making.
Thanks, Julian. I'm going to read out something from the chat. Jesse has commented your beautiful slides and graphics and is asking, is living evidence mostly used for policy making now? Any other fields, example, pharmacoepi, that are applying this mode?
Yeah, I'd say in general, it's been more practice focused, and it's now kind of the policy application of this is now kind of more emerging. But yeah, I think your point around pharmacoepi is kind of, again, links back to the comment I just made around kind of drug development and drug device development and licensing and reimbursement. So yeah, like for example, in Australia, we've been working a lot with people who work in pharmacoepi, pharmacosurveillance, essentially trying to piece together systems where we can have a much more dynamic understanding of the benefits and harms of particular drugs during that kind of post-licensing period, and then that feeding back into kind of either regulatory and reimbursement decision making. So again, anyone here is interested in pursuing that and thinking about the connections between that and evidence synthesis and the guidelines, yeah, I think there's huge opportunities to kind of push forward on that front.
Great. And from Raju, in the living guidelines or systematic review projects, what measures do you take to identify retracted articles and corrections? Something we do that comes up every now and then. Two articles which were already included in the synthesis, those might or might not affect already generated evidence.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and obviously becoming more and more topical. I think for a long time, the evidence world has kind of underappreciated the harms from fraudulent research or just mistaken results. And so I think it varies by project. And again, this is one of the, I think when thinking around living evidence, there's many things where it's useful to think, is this unique to living evidence, or is it somewhat a kind of more widespread or more generic issue? So I think this issue is relevant across the whole evidence field, but particularly in the living evidence model, very clearly there's more opportunity in a much more real-time and dynamic way to, if appropriate, to remove information from our syntheses, as opposed to, say, a traditional systematic review that's been published and say an included study is then found to be fraudulent. It's then just mechanically difficult. You can add an addendum, an erratum, but that's just kind of a process that can be just quite difficult. Whereas in a living evidence mode, it's much easier than to just remove that evidence, and then the next version is that piece of evidence is removed.
All right. And Jody asks another practical question. How do journal editors know when is the right time to publish a living evidence review? And maybe, Julian, if I can ask you to even more broadly, also just generally talk about your suggestions for the publication model for this.
Yeah, I would say this is still an area where we've got a lot of work to do in general. So it is possible to publish living reviews, living guidelines. You can think of a broad category of living publications, and that actually extends further. And there are people who are just interested in that per se. In traditional journals, so for example, Annals of Internal Medicine have been really one of the journals at the forefront of this. It can be difficult. So you can certainly publish the baseline, as it were, as the first version. The question then becomes, how do I publish the next versions? People have experimented with different models, so it could be addendums or letters. That's obviously pretty clunky. Other journals, as it were, like Cochrane, have a more well-established versioning system. And so you have the kind of primary version and then and then kind of subversions. Some, including Cochrane, and there's a publisher in the UK called F1000, have managed to negotiate with many of the kind of bibliometric organizations, so including National Library of Medicine, Altmetrics, etc., essentially to group the metrics that accrue. So, for example, sites across those different versions. And so in those models, actually, what does work well is the authors can then make decisions about whether an update is a major update or a minor update. And in a minor update, essentially your metrics are grouped so that you have more sites per publication, or whether you then say, okay, this is a new major update, and then essentially you're splitting your metrics so any further sites would accrue to that next version. And so then you get more publications, but of course the citations are then distributed across those individual publications, as it were. I think from that explanation, you can understand that this is still a work in progress. It's pretty clunky. So BMJ, Annals, Cochrane, and F1000 are really the 4 publishers that have got the most experience with this. So if you're wanting to do this, they might be publishers to consider. In practice, what we've found more generically works quite well is to say, you disseminate through a website or other kind of, web-based kind of resource. And then you have intermittent academic publications that are kind of derived from that. So they become like a secondary output. And we've often found that there's many, many, many opportunities to get a traditional academic publication. So they can be snapshots of the review or the guidelines. So that could be every 6 months or 12 months or whatever, and that can work quite well. And then, of course, you often, because this is still quite new, got lots of opportunities to publish like a paper describing the project, a methods paper, very, very lots and lots of opportunities to build many different kind of academic outputs around the project itself.
Thanks, Julian. Maybe in the last minute or so, Julian, if you can, I know pretty much your entire presentation was forward-looking, right? Can you maybe make a prediction or some sort of, what do you see the future, let's say, maybe 10 years from now, in terms of the role of the traditional non-living or one-and-done systematic review?
Maybe just a quick comment that's backward-looking. Again, I keep saying this is not rocket science. It's not even new. So right. when Ian Chalmers and others were setting up Cochrane, their vision was living reviews. The idea was a database of trials with overviews, i.e. systematic reviews, that would be updated whenever new data became available. So that was the original vision. It's just, through various challenges not been achieved. I think the future is that systematic review becomes a data science. I think at the moment this is music to your ears, Ian. It's very document centric at the moment. We ingest documents, we do work, and we create documents. I think in the future it'll be much more a kind of data focused endeavor. So it'll be ingesting data, finding data, managing data, analyzing data, outputting data. So living evidence, I think, is just kind of one of the ways that we're trying to move the world towards that future. Yeah.
It's a great note to end on. Thank you, Julian. And thank you, everybody, for attending and for your questions and discussion. Julian, many thanks again for a stimulating presentation and a discussion as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to Amy and all of you for spending time, and great discussion. Thanks for all the questions.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.